Auschwitz was known as one of the most horrific concentration camps of the Holocaust, and just about every Jew there was a victim of the violence. However, it was the intellectual minds that suffered the most. Philosophers like Jean Amory were forced into manual labor, and 9 times out of 10, intellectuals were physically incapable of completing their work. Therefore, they were sent to their deaths. And so, the Third Reich, through various forms of torture, instilled in the minds of the intellectuals that their abilities were useless, and so were they. Intellectuals were easily broken down physically, but the Nazis used torture to mentally brainwash the intellectuals in their camps. The story of the Jean Amory describes the Holocaust as an attack on German intellectual freedom. The Nazis made it so that there was no need for an intellectual mind in their Third Reich society. It was imperative that they eliminated all of their enemies' intellectual groups primarily. The question is, why? Why were the intellectuals the main target of the Nazi Party? And why were their intellectual abilities so easily diminished in Auschwitz? Jewish philosopher Jean Amory's story as an Austrian Jew in the concentration camp of Auschwitz explains to the readers of his autobiography the answers to these questions. Amory's At the Mind's Limits is a collection of essays that was composed in book form in 1966. It is a first-hand account written by a Holocaust survivor regarding the harsh realities of being an intellectual at the concentration camp in Auschwitz. Amory's experience differs with others, but he makes it clear that he is making no generalizations. Some call this book a polemic because of some of Amory's extremist views regarding the essence of National Socialism. However, Amory uses his own experience as evidence to the claim that torture is the essence of National Socialism. Jean Amory was born an Austrian Jew, and he is a very well-known philosopher, who just so happens to also be a Holocaust survivor. His analysis of the intellectual response to the Holocaust provides readers with not only stories that involve Nazi violence, but more importantly, the everlasting effects that followed the Holocaust. His autobiography was published in 1980, and it is clear that the atrocities that happened to him still haunted him to that very day. Amory, having gone through these stages of Nazi torture firsthand, blesses the reader with the opportunity to see this mental and physical torture through the eyes of someone who has endured it, has endured the physical aspect and the mental aspect of the torture. Amory is an intellectual who lived through a period in the Holocaust that diminished his capabilities as an intellectual. In Auschwitz, he explains how he lacked intellectual companionship, and his testimony focuses strictly on the deformation of the mind due to the lack of communion with intellectuals like himself. Amory's experience in Auschwitz completely disregarded anything he did there in which his intellectual ability was actually needed. Therefore, he came to the conclusion that every Jew at that camp thought this way, and there were no more intellectuals left, only him. He mentions Primo Levi in this chapter. Primo Levi was a bunkmate of his, and his situation at Auschwitz was completely different than Amory's. Jean Amory describes the Holocaust as an attack on German intellectual freedom. The Nazis made it so that there was no need for an intellectual mind in their Third Reich society. It was imperative that they eliminated all of their enemies' intellectual groups primarily. The question is, why? Why were the intellectuals the main target of the Nazi Party? And why were their intellectual abilities so easily diminished in Auschwitz? Jewish philosopher Jean Amory's story as an Austrian Jew in the concentration camp of Auschwitz explains to the readers of his autobiography the answers to these questions. Amory notes in the first chapter that Primo Levi was a chemist and he was employed in Auschwitz with accordance to his profession. There is a huge difference between Amory's At the Mind's Limits and Levi's If That Be a Man. And the difference is, Levi is not a lot more open with his interpretation of the Third Reich. It is evident that Amory holds a heavier grudge against the Third Reich, because his living conditions in Auschwitz had a direct correlation on the so-called polemic he wrote in 1966. The intellectual at Auschwitz aimed to be a critique of Amory's At the Mind's Limits. Levi describes Amory's personality as naturally skeptic and pessimistic. Basically, Levi calls Amory out for being forced into his religion. According to Levi, Omri was largely ignorant to Jewish tradition and life. And so, Levy is arguing that At the Mind's Limits is written strictly out of anger towards the Third Reich and not out of faith for the Jewish religion. Levy is optimistic, but that is only because of the circumstances he was blessed with at Auschwitz.
The fact that Omri is a philosopher was the deciding factor of his fate at Auschwitz. His field of work was not wanted or needed, and so he was forced into manual labor. In his eyes, intellect was of no use with regards to coping with the harsh realities of Auschwitz. Rational and analytic thinking was unable to provide support and direction, and so this type of thinking was typically thrown away by prisoners at Auschwitz, forcing them to accept SS logic and the SS system of values. Amory may be a pessimist, but all of his claims are backed up with facts from his own experience and or logical thought. In Amory's view, the intellectual is skeptic and humanistic, and they do not fit in the category of Orthodox Jews like Levy. He ends the intellectual chapter with a confession that while they didn't leave the camp wiser and deeper, they left smarter.
The title, At the Mind's Limits, explains to the reader exactly what it's like to be in a subjective state of mind. This particular essay describes those effects along with vivid details of personal accounts in which Amory himself was tortured. Torture, according to him, was the reality that Auschwitz had an effect on its prisoners that reduced the self into something purely physical. When Amory experienced this reduction of the self, he lost all faith in the world and in humanity. When he joined the resistance movement and was caught by the Nazis in 1943, he was tortured by the SS. However, in the beginning pages of this essay, he describes torture as visiting Fort Breedlove and recollecting the atrocities committed against him by the Nazis. The torture itself, in Amory's words, was relatively harmless. However, he admits that torture is the most horrible event that a human being can experience. He writes about the thick walls of the Breedlove vault and how his screams couldn't even penetrate them. According to him, torture was not simply an accidental quality of the Third Reich, but actually it was its essence. He describes the first blow as the instance in which he lost trust in the world. He felt violated. He uses facts about human nature to get his point across of how torture dehumanized him. He had no help and he knew it. He was less than a human that very moment, and he believes that this was the result that the Third Reich wanted. Torture is the essence of international socialism. He writes about Hitler and how he used torture to be recognized by the Fuhrer. He quotes, "He had to torture, destroy, in order to be great in bearing the suffering of others." End quote. According to Amory, the Nazis tortured simply because they were torturers. They were servants to the institution of torture. Torture transformed him into simply a body, and his intellectual ability for a long time was lost. All in all, the intellectual response to the Holocaust was remarkable. There was no place for an intellectual mind in an Auschwitz concentration camp. Auschwitz was among the most brutal of all the concentration camps that emerged during the Holocaust. According to Amory, the intellectual was alone with his intellect, and there was no social reality that could support and confirm it. At the Mind's Limits is focused on Amory's own experience, but any intellectual placed in his position in Auschwitz could relate. Primo Levi debates his so-called pessimistic opinions because he hardly struggled as much as Amory did in Auschwitz. According to Amory, when he lost his intellectual ability, or even the opportunity to exercise it, he lost his purpose and faith in the world. Amory's description of his own experiences with Nazi torture, resentment, bitterness, and how his circumstances forced him to regain his self-dignity through embracing his Jewish identity. Thanks to people like Amory, the Jewish faith is as strong as it has ever been, and there is no shame in revisiting their past because the Jewish people who endured the Holocaust are no longer considered as victims, but they are finally considered as victors and heroes, and they are living proof that faith conquers all.